Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome back to this session. This morning, and so far we've had quite a bit of information. And this morning, on this session, we are going to cover the strategic response to cyber attacks by Jason Bergerson. And I just give you a little bit of background on Jason. He's a highly motivated technology and management executive, experienced in leading the FIR and e-discovery investigations, consulting engagements, and building strong teams. He's skilled in security, digital forensics, and the e-discovery processes and tools. He's an expert in reporting and affidavit and declaration writing, depositions and testimony. He is very skilled. He has quite a few technical skills, but what we want to do now is to invite Jason Bergerson to go ahead and do his presentation. Jason, it's over to you.
Great, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here, and hopefully it will be informative and generate some questions. I left time at the end to make sure that we have time for questions. So the session that we're in right now is the strategic response to cyber attacks. And a couple of things, this is a pared down version of the course description or the webinar description. It's the couple of things I really wanted to try to key off of when we talk today is what are some of the strategies that are used by cyber gangs or cyber criminals, even if they're not part of a larger group. There's a lot to cybersecurity on the defense side, but oftentimes the attackers use pretty tried and true methodologies for breach. There are a few ways that most companies are vulnerable to, and that's usually how they, criminals like to take the easy way in if they can. So they tend to do it the same way over and over again. And then what can you do about that? And not just what can you do about it, but how can you ensure that what you're doing is comprehensive, that you're not missing some steps, that the personnel you have are experienced and trained to actually do that. A lot of times companies will bootstrap themselves up through a cyber breach by using their IT team. And while IT teams can be very skilled at their domain of expertise, doing an investigation and doing a breach response and all the components that go with that and finding the indicators is a different skill set. It's more of an investigative mindset, and making sure you have the right people on your team, whether that's actually on your team or brought in as an agency, a consultancy, is really important. So I had an about me slide. I wasn't sure what introductions were going to be. So hello again. My name is Jason Bergerson. I'm the global senior director for DFIR at Trustwave. That's really all about that. There isn't much more. I've been doing this for a long time. I calculated it once. I think I started my hardcore technical journey in 2003. So I hit my 20-year mark doing technology and security, which made me feel old, if I'm being honest. All right, so let's dive right into the kind of the content. Most people know the if not but when adage in part of security. You can have the greatest security in the world. The problem is you have to be perfect every time. And threat actors just have to be good once. Somebody has to be not mindful of a phishing email. Someone has to inadvertently expose a system to the internet. Somebody has to forget one time to not update a security patch for a 0-day type vulnerability or a very early vulnerability. Companies have to be perfect every time. So it's a constant battle, really, to try to make sure your organizations are protected. Some stats here to kind of frame this up for you is the the more unprepared you are, the more expensive a breach scenario can become. So the 3.86 million is US dollars, is the average cost of a data breach, including everything like damages, reputations, getting the data back. I was listening a little bit in the earlier presentation when talking about risk transference strategies. And this is where sometimes people will think that, well, I have a cyber insurance policy, so this can be transferred to them. Some of the damage through a breach might be, but if it's a reputational damage, how much more future business are you losing? If it's a downtime, how much business are you losing while you're down? And some of that might be covered depending on your policy and whatnot, but it's still damage. It still is an issue that takes your teams away from their normal business operations. Oftentimes, people inside of organizations are trying to do their day job and trying to remediate from a breach. So now you get burnout, and you might end up losing personnel over a thing like this. And it is hard to calculate sometimes the true damages and the true loss from being breached. But as bad as that sounds, 2 million more is additional costs if you don't have any kind of IR maturity type plan. If you don't have a IR plan, you don't have playbooks, you don't have regular tabletops, you don't have a security awareness program, where you don't have a lot of things in place. Because what it does is it increases the time to discovery and then the time to remediation. And on top of that, if you don't include some type of security automation, machine learning, some kind of ability to aggregate all of the events that come through, can be sometimes millions of events that are being parsed. Humans are not able to do that quickly enough. And so having some kind of automation will again reduce the amount of time to discovery. So in the breach impact on time, 280 days, that's the amount of days that a threat actor on average is inside of someone's environment doing whatever they would like before they're discovered. And then once they're discovered, it's an additional 54 days on average to recover from the breach. So if you put those two together, you could be looking at over 300 days. That's a year. A threat actor being active to some level in your environment for a year on average, costing almost $9.5 million if you're unprepared. That is some staggering numbers if you think about on average. And what are threat actors after? They're after money. There's some activist stuff that's happening. There's some people who do it for the thrill of the hunt, and they're not really after anything. They just want to, cause damage. But most of the reason is people are after money. And they get that through either intellectual property or isolating your data so that you don't have access to it. And that doesn't have to be because the data itself is valuable. The loss of access to the data is what's valuable. So in particular, I'm going to talk a little bit more about ransomware as kind of a case study for this whole process, because that is still a top concern. Some people have wondered over the past little bit, is ransomware still a thing? 3 or 4 years ago, it was very high on the sort of like the news cycle of what was happening, and it's from the reporting of it, it seemed like it might have calmed down, but it hasn't calmed down. It's still a top concern of executives. The ransom attacks have been more frequent. 66% of organizations surveyed were hit with ransomware in 2021. So it's happening more often. The demands are increasing. And it's not just a regional problem, it's globally. What these threat actor groups are doing is they're organizing into groups. And so they end up having sort of like your typical gang scenario where they have leaders of the gang who are highly skilled cybersecurity. They could be highly skilled cybersecurity professionals if they would use their, powers for good, but they're very good at developing these ransomware kits. And then they have lieutenants below them that run sort of local hacker gangs for them. And then there's a bunch of soldiers who can deploy techniques. They can take the kits that they get from the cyber gangs and basically run the hustle, right? Run the attacks, and it all rolls up. It's a very very organized, very wealthy enterprise, much like your sort of classic thinking of organized crime, where you've got the leaders of the group, you've got their regional lieutenants in the field, and you've got the soldiers that work for them. In many ways, it's structured the same way. It's just with cyber security and cyber data breach. But it is all on the rise. And assuming that you're protected without doing at least some level of continuous care is what gets you into that other slide, where you might be good in a point of time, but if you don't monitor it and don't maintain that same level of alertness over time, you will be less prepared. And the more less prepared you are, the more expensive it gets. So what are some of the ways that threat actors actually go about doing this? And this is sort of some big bucket ideas, or big bucket thinking about what they're kind of after or how they do stuff. And it's kind of been, I've categorized anyway, kind of three separate behaviors that are pretty identifiable between each of them. The slow and steady is sort of your classic, when you think about an advanced persistent threat, where the threat actor gets in, they've tried to remain silent. They're trying to, like, maximum penetration, maximum credentials, maximum elevation of their rights. They're trying to put persistent mechanisms everywhere. They may deploy a ransomware or exfiltrate data or something, but they may also be a credentials broker. And so they're in your organization trying to be as quiet as possible to get the most amount of access as possible, so they could then sell that. And then whoever buys that will do whatever they would like. This is potentially the most exposure is this way, because one of the things they can deploy in that slow and steady are keyloggers. So either they've got remote access to the systems, they've got keyloggers on the systems, they're reading the emails, they're doing all the things you would really not want them to do, to try to then not just move laterally within the organization, but move from organization to organization. So if the person that was breached was, say, a supply chain company, and that company now has access because they're a vendor to dozens of other companies, and they're logging into those other systems, now you've created a third-party supply chain breach because they've been inside your organization for a long time gaining intelligence. So it's not quite as common now compared to the other ones because it takes so much time. But it still happens, and it still can be quite damaging. And most people who do that one, like I said, are kind of after credential harvesting, so they can then sell that on the dark web. The middle one is when you think about data exfiltration, and when people are really concerned, well, is my data out on the dark web? Did they steal anything? Are they trying to sell it? When this one applies is when the value of your data is known, right? You know what it is. It's credit card information. It's personally identifiable information, because you can do then identity fraud. The speed with which these go compared to the slow and steady is much faster. And this is one of the more probably the most common version of the three of them right now, is there is a fast in, fast exfiltration, and fast ransom. The combination of the data exfiltration and the ransom sort of increases the likelihood that someone might pay. As companies get better at responding to the ransomware issue by having good backups and systems that they can be reinstalled quickly, they're bringing themselves back online quick enough that they're not worried about paying the ransom as much as they were a few years ago. But now you add data exfiltration to it, where that data could be sold on the dark web. So now it's more of extorting, pay or will expose your data. They still might do it because they have it. You can't ever really confirm that they're going to delete it. But how companies oftentimes notice this one is the ransom note. So the better you can get at noticing the initial infiltration, the better off you'll be at stopping any of these. But this valuable data one, instead of it being months and being in there for a long time, like the slow and steady option, this one usually is even those on average 280 days before you are there noticed, is much smaller than that. It might be a month. The threat actors are only in there, weeks, not months, to try to get as much of the data as they can as quickly as they can, so that they, if they get noticed, at least they've gotten something. And then the last thing they do is they deploy the ransomware, which is really their calling card to say, you've been owned, we have your data, call here to pay, otherwise we won't, we'll sell your data to get our money that way. And then the last one is data access. And data access and valuable data sound very similar, but the value of the data isn't really what they're after. What they're after is your lack of access to the data. So what they're trying to do is shut the business down. And if that business is a critical infrastructure type business, or banking, or something with high trade, where the impact of that business being down will be widespread, then it's the sense of urgency of having that business be up and running is where they have their leverage. So while you may not need to pay the ransom to bring things back up and running, if bringing things back up will take 4 weeks, what's the impact of being down that long? Is it's going to be significant to the organization, to the region, to the country? If it's significant, then paying the ransom, this is the threat actor's mindset, then paying the ransom becomes a more viable option, because the lack of having access to your critical systems is a critical infrastructure problem. So how do these attackers work, right? So I mentioned before that the attack patterns are largely similar, almost regardless of the type of breach you have. The nuances of the breaches might be a little different, like your business email compromise, what has been compromised, where you go after getting the evidence to try to find how they got in, how far they went, is going to be different between like a business email compromise, between keylogger malware, between an exposed system to the internet that had an exploit on it, or a phishing email campaign. But they all have to have some sort of initial compromise component. So the threat actors, what they're looking for are weaknesses in the system. They might use open source information to try to find exposed servers with known vulnerabilities. They might use email lists that they buy off the dark web with people that might have compromised accounts, that they've used their work account for personal reasons, and wherever they used it got breached, and now they have a username and a password associated to your organization that was not anything to do with your organization's breach, but that data is still out there. And if they can correlate a number of similar passwords between a number of different users, then the likelihood of a password stuffing sort of credential process might work. So they all have to have some level of access. For any of this stuff to work, they have to have access to the systems. So they either gain remote access or they gain email access through a cloud. That is what gets them, I like to term it the critical pathway. They need to go from no access to a critical system sort of access where they can continue to elevate their rights, which gets us into that middle section. This is a loop. They're constantly doing a discovery. What do they see? What do they have access to? Try to gain access to it. Once they get access to the next thing, what do they see? What does that have access to? Can they continually to move laterally within the environment from subdomain to subdomain or subnet to subnet? They look for elevation of rights so that they can create new unknown users that can hide. And this is part of that advanced persistence. Can they make registry changes so that anytime the system is shut down and rebooted, they still have their backdoor access to the systems? Can they get access to servers? Can they get access to server administrative groups so they can insert themselves into your good role-based access list that you have? And if the new user is created and it's inserted into one and it's largely left dormant, that's a credential harvesting and to sell that new credential on the dark web. So as long as it goes undetected, that's the new way in. But they do that elevation and penetration loop until they've gone through the environment as deeply as they want to, and they get access to the data that they believe will make them their money. And then they have their exit strategy. Sometimes, like I said, that could be selling the information that they have, the credentials that they've harvested directly. Sometimes that could be still remaining silent, but starting to impact additional companies that they now have access to through the first breach. And if it's undetected in those other companies where the breach really started, they can do that for a long time. They're maintaining their, they're maintaining their access to your organization, but you're unaware of it because they're not really exiting their exit strategy and you haven't noticed them yet. But eventually they think they're going to get caught. They want to get their money for all their work. So most often the exit strategy is ransomware. They'll take whatever they want and they'll deploy the ransomware. But even if it's not, this three-part attack pattern is very common. If the threat actors had developed their own playbook, this would be their playbook. Gain access, elevate, penetrate. What's my exit strategy? And when you start looking at threat actor groups, these are the things those threat actor groups start to be known for. So, is this a credential broker threat actor group? And they have pretty consistent patterns for how they go about their work, the tool sets they use, the binaries you're looking for. And this is where having the experience of the industry in your incident response team will benefit greatly, because some might be ransomware ones, some might be keylogger ones, some might go only after particular types of exploits. So if you know how the initial breach happened, because you have a particular exploitable system in place, and you can find some of those key the key behaviors, then you can oftentimes attribute it to a threat actor group, or at least someone who's behaving the same way. And all of a sudden now you have a lot of the investigative pieces to go looking for, because they like efficiency as well. The more they can breach, the faster they can breach it, the more money they'll make. So why reinvent the wheel if it works for you? They've got their own training, they've got their own toolkits, they've got their own processes. They follow it over and over and over again. So initial compromise, elevation of penetration, exit strategy over and over and over again. So again, staying with the ransomware sort of threat model idea, it's more than just encryption. So there is the classic encryption, but I was listening to in the earlier session, somebody made a comment about it. Used to be you'd load up a Linux system, and you were pretty good. Most even Macs were sort of that way. Most systems that had some sort of attack against it were Windows, because not that Windows is horrible in its architecture, not any more so than Linux or Mac. It's just it has such a large market share of all of the desktops and laptops that are out there in the business world. Why would you go after Linux or Macs? That was one of their original thinkings, right? We're trying to there's only so much time in a day, even for bad guys. So what are we going to build our technology against? Well, that's a while ago. Their sophistication has increased dramatically. So now they got these ransomware as a service providers. Their code is the same code can be used across multiple platforms. It can detect the types of software it's on. It will deploy itself. It will encrypt the data. So while, yes, it's still encryption, the quantities of platforms that now are exploitable by threat actors is pretty much anything. Anything that's a computer is susceptible. Internet of Things are hackable. The laptops, desktops, virtual machines, it doesn't really matter. Hypervisors themselves, it almost doesn't really matter what the technology is. If it's connected to the internet and connected to your internal network, it is most likely exploitable some way into your environment. So as I mentioned before, the exfiltration piece, is used as a double extortion to try to ensure the ransom payment is made. The threat of the data being being sold in the dark web is sometimes sufficient for companies to decide to make a payment, even if they could get all of their data up and running, all their systems remediated, and everything's fine from an ongoing business operations. Just the fact that there's documented data that's left is sufficient sometimes for people to decide to make the payment. So email, as long as the threat actors are in the environment, they oftentimes go after multiple things. So they may primarily be there to exfiltrate the data and do a ransomware attack, but they may then also initiate phishing campaigns from your email that they've now gained access to other companies to try to, it's their own version of cross-sell, upsell, right? How do you get more business? You'll infiltrate more companies. How do you infiltrate more companies? Use a trusted relationship. So they've exposed your company and they've gotten into another company through a trusted relationship. Someone's clicked on the link, someone's downloaded the malware package. Now that company's breached as well. And then lastly, like I said, there's other ways to do harvesting. Again, as long as you're on the systems and as long as what you're going to do has a high chance of remaining undetected, keyloggers and other remote access devices are still used quite a bit. It exposes personal data. The individual users now could be logging into other organizations, logging into their banking records, whatever they're logging into. And it's especially, like I said, if the company that was breached is a third-party provider of services to other companies, any of those systems that they're logging into on those downstream companies through both the emails for phishing campaigns and the keyloggers just propagates outside of the organization into other organizations, which really highlights, I think, the importance of being mindful. Again, listening to the earlier one talking about the culture of security is very important. But as we'll start in the next little section here, equally important to make sure you have a culture of security is to have a framework, to have some kind of plan in place. And this is where, again, having your trusted partners that are skilled in all the areas. This particular model is the NIST framework. So that loop that I was talking about is that blue and gold one in the middle, the detect, analysis, containment, eradicate, recovery. So it's a cat and mouse game. As the threat actors are doing their work to try and propagate themselves, we're doing the work to try and detect it, like analyze the systems, pull the evidence, do all the things as far as the response process goes. But if you don't have a larger view towards the life cycle of a breach and the whole response framework, you could be missing something. And while it might seem that you've eradicated a threat actor, you may not have fully eradicated it. You may have only treated the initial symptoms, but there's other persistence mechanisms that went undetected. Pardon me. Or there's other data that's been exfiltrated, and now you've got maybe a duty to notify that you didn't know about because the full threat of indicators wasn't identified or analyzed. So having qualified, having trained, having certified breach responders help you is key to those two sections, the detect, analyze, and containment, eradicate, and recovery. Having good cybersecurity professionals wrapped with that is key to ensuring that at least you've learned something from this. So in the classic sort of this framework, it's the green box to red box. I like this one. It's shown as a circle, but it doesn't show as well on a slide. It's really a continuous loop. You should always be preparing and always be testing as much as you can do. So preparation, what are your plans? What are your playbooks? What are your tabletops? What are your penetration testing that you're doing? Do you have compliance requirements? Are you, ISO certified or something different? If you're in the credit card industry, do you have PCI requirements or taking payments? I mean, not a credit card company. All of those preparation is important, that you stay as ready as possible, and included in that preparation should be someone who specializes in breach. Most companies don't have those people in-house because it's not needed. The likelihood of you being breached continuously is pretty low. So having a continuous on-staff personnel who's skilled at doing breach response is really not needed. But having a partner ready to go so that you're not, it's like in the heat of battle, you don't want to be figuring out who your help is. So if you have relationships in the beginning, or just determine those relationships in the beginning, you'll be in a better spot. They'll know your environment, they'll know your systems, they'll know your personnel. You can work on fast ways of engaging. You can create break glass accounts so that they are gaining access to, let's say, your Microsoft environment quickly, so that they can jump in right away and help detecting and analyzing, so they can get to containment, eradicate, and recovery as quickly as possible. And that's all the preparation piece. But once you do get popped, then what happens after the fact? If you're not doing some kind of post-mortem, and this is again where your consultant should be leading you through that, to say, this is the analysis we got, and we can tell you how your systems were compromised, and here are our recommendations. Like, how are we going to fix this to make it better? Well, it looks like I forgot to get rid of an animation. So if we think about this post-breach world, sometimes when you get that first ransom note, there can be a doom and gloom sort of feeling that sets in. It's like, oh my gosh, everything's burning down, everything's bad. Just remember, it's never too late. It's never too late to start and do something. It might be bad, but doing nothing about it is worse. So get your professional on the horn, right? Have a conversation. Tell them, when did you notice stuff? What did you notice? What did you do about it? Isolate your systems. Isolating is good, overwriting is bad. If you can isolate them, whether you're like physically pulling the plug, or you have an endpoint in your managed detection system and you can isolate that way, or you shut down the virtual machine, like whatever isolate means, isolate those systems. That will start to prevent access from the threat actor. And if they've compromised that system, prevent that system from compromising other things. Why overwriting is bad initially is because you lose all your evidence. Even if you just turn the system off, that can be bad. The memory that's on those systems and the volatile data is highly critical to being able to successfully investigate the processes that are running, even if the systems, the threat actors technology is such that they try to obfuscate and make it really hard to discover what's on there. Computers work the way they work. You can't run a process if it's not running the process in memory. So memory dumps oftentimes can be your first, best, fastest way of determining a lot of things. Well, if you've shut the system down, you've lost the memory. And if you've wiped the system to redeploy it, you've lost the rest of the evidence as well. So isolate the systems as quickly as you can with good business justifications, like what is the system? What is the impact of isolating? Is isolating going to be worse than leaving it on, knowing the threat actor's there because it's doing other business critical things? It's still a risk calculus, but isolation should be your first thought. Then you preserve your evidence, because from your preservation of memories and volatile data and disk images, firewall logs, Microsoft Exchange, audit logs, Office 365, like wherever the logging is part of your evidence preservation process. So you can do your analysis. The incident, so DFIR put together as an acronym is, the digital forensics piece. Its objectives are slightly different than the incident response piece. Incident response is oftentimes about quickly eradicating and remediating, right? Contain the damage, eradicate the threat actor, recover the data as quickly as you can. But the forensics process has to go alongside of that, so that you're preserving the data, you're doing your forensic investigation, so you can create a findings report that is then usable in courts of law, can be used to provide to insurance carriers for adjusting claims. It can be used if you're trying to demonstrate that it was an inside threat actor as opposed to an outside threat actor. And now you either want to terminate the person, you want to bring criminal charges against them. Like whatever the reasoning is, the DF and the IR have to work together. And again, someone who's skilled as a incident response professional can do both of those things. What we find oftentimes, if people use either less trained or less experienced, or like I said before, like highly skilled IT people, just not skilled in the response process, people put a very high focus on the incident response piece and they're back up and running again, but you can't prove anything. So all of your other downstream processes that might be required now became a lot more challenging. So you have to do these two things at the same time. Quickly isolate, so that's part of your incident response process. Quickly preserve, that's part of your digital forensics process, right? Do analysis to try to figure out everywhere they went, a little bit of both. Quickly eradicate, incident response, and quickly remediate. If you don't have any endpoint detection systems, oftentimes temporarily one can be deployed in your environment. What that helps is identify any further alerts that might be happening while you're trying to eradicate and remediate. As I mentioned earlier, persistence is one of the sort of key things that a threat actor will try to do. So they're trying to stay one step ahead. If you think your classic, purple team training exercise, red team, blue team, the threat actors are the red team. The cyber defense is the blue team. And it's this cat and mouse game where the red team is trying to stay just ahead of the blue team. Well, the threat actors are trying to stay just ahead of the cybersecurity teams that are trying to get rid of them. So having an endpoint detection system, like I said, at least temporarily, if you don't already have one deployed in your environment, can help identify other activity. So a human isn't trying to manage millions of alerts. You can use machine learning. You can use trends. You can put in hashes for binaries. You can put in IP numbers for command and control servers. Like whatever the case may be, you can put in particular users. If those users have been compromised, if they've been, if the user's account has also been isolated, but that same account has been attempted to be authorized in some other system. If you have a good detection system in place, that will alert you. So you can see what the threat actors are trying to do and then try to get ahead of them. So ransomware can be very concerning. Like I said, it's the one threat that keeps cybersecurity, like CISOs and stuff, keeps them up at night still. But if you really think about it, ransomware is just a software. It's a very damaging software, but it has to function largely like other softwares have to function. So most good response plans will also work with ransomware. So some of the key things that you want to have in your environment, and some of the key things that the incident response professional will ask you about, is your early detection. Like, what is your early detection? Do you have all your logs dumped to a SIM system? Do you have an EDR, XDR in place? Do you have everything going to a data lake and you have some sort of business analytics software that goes against it, right? What is your detection system? Do you have an early detection system? Like, how was it originally noticed that there was something going wrong, that you might have had a threat actor in your environment? That detection system will be your initial source of data during your investigation. As I said earlier, the initial compromise methods are not unique. Phishing for all types of data breaches or exit strategies is still the most common way in. Humans can be your greatest asset for security if they're well-trained and motivated, but they also are their largest liability. People get tired. There's multi-factor fatigue is a thing. So if you have the push button authentication and a threat actor just 2 in the morning, authenticate, eventually users will just hit accept to get their phones to shut up. So the techniques that threat actors use are very similar, regardless of what their ultimate goal is. So if you know where those logs are, if you know how emails work, if you have some sort of link protection that can scan links to scan documents, what is your antivirus that you have in place, that a lot of those sort of standard response plan things can work if they're configured correctly and monitored well. That kind of goes into the basic endpoint detection and network detection stuff. Can also be very effective. If you have your firewall is an IPS firewall where you've got the protection enabled, it can stop a lot of the attacks, including DDoS type attacks. The technology is it's fairly well known to try to stop these things. It's just to try to get them all working together. Is it something that's warranted in your environment? Those are the decisions you're trying to make. And again, if you do get breached, the incident response person that you bring on board is going to ask all these questions during a scoping call. Like, what is your early detection? Do you have an EDR? Where are those logs kept? Can we get access to the dashboard? Do you have to pull the data for us because there's maybe regulatory reasons why a third party wouldn't have access to your dashboards? What is the configuration of your existing mitigations? Like, how is this set up? What kind of segmentation do you have in place? Do you have a network diagram that can help confirm that, try to confirm the scope, what assets are in scope and which assets are most likely out of scope? Your segmentation diagrams will help to know that. Where are your backups? Oftentimes people will have a good virtualized environment, and one of the virtual servers is their backup server, and the data is stored in the same place that all their virtual systems are stored. Well, if the hypervisors is what gets popped and you've lost all of your virtual systems, then you've also lost all of your backups. So having those sorts of thoughts in place, like, well, the what if scenario, sitting around a round table and having the how bad could bad get what if scenarios, especially if you bring in someone who's done these like readiness assessments and things with you, can be a great way to identify all of the parts that could use improvement. But the improvement itself doesn't necessarily have to be super expensive. Configuration can be a part of it. Monitoring it can be a part of it. Oftentimes business continuity plans are rolled into this as well. And you may have already needed to, like for hurricanes, what is the plan of a hurricane takes out a particular facility? It's like, well, that can be a useful plan. Is what if you needed to remediate from a ransomware? Like losing a system because the building collapsed and you losing a system because the ransomware destroyed it, you still need to rebuild a system. You still need to have figured out what your critical pathways are. Like how many domain controllers do you need? What has to control the, what is our, say, e-commerce point? What does the web server look like? Like whatever your critical pathway systems are, has already been contemplated in your business continuity plan. So borrow from it. I just have one more slide here. So we're nearing the end, and I should have plenty of time for some questions. So closing the loop. The NIST plan says recovery, and I don't actually like that word because to me, it's limiting. When you recover something, you've brought that particular system back up like it was before. You've recovered from the damage. The word I prefer is remediate, and it's slightly different because to me, remediate means not only have you recovered from the particular breach, but you've done the work, you've done the post-incident work to try to remediate the threat. So if you bring your system back up running to the same state it was before, you still have that vulnerability. You still have that exposure that you had before. So if it was a user, what is the documentation? Like, where are they supposed to go? How do we improve systems, right? So the professional that you hire to do the breach response piece should have a wider view of security practices as a whole. So not only will they say, here is how it happened, but they'll follow that up with, here's what we recommend to try to prevent that from happening again. If you implement those security controls, and the way I did this documentation, training, and technology, that's really people, process, and technology, right? Those are the three biggies. So documentation is process. Did our plan work? Did we have a playbook for this? Did the users know what they were supposed to do? Did we have somebody to call? Did we have issues with our escalation and now the senior leadership wasn't informed as timely as they should have been, and they didn't know what it was we were trying to communicate? Just became hard because of process. Training is largely security training. Again, did the people know how to do it? But also, did we do a tabletop? Did anybody even know who to call when one of these things happened? And lastly is the technology piece. And since this is all after the fact, you do have a little bit more time. But the key to really closing the remediation loop is finding those recommendations, is at least documenting what in an ideal state should be done. Then you can decide, of that ideal state, what should be done, what can you actually accomplish. So that's the whole presentation. Thank you very much for everybody's time. I can, like I said, I have availability for some questions if there are some.
Yes, I want to start off with one question. From a board perspective, what would be the strategy you think that the board would need to be concerned about in terms of dealing with responding to cyber attacks? What would be the strategic approach that the board should be asking for?
Sure. So one of the key things that I think people need is, especially board level people, need to be mindful of is the sort of phrase of due diligence, due care. The having a plan is sort of the due care piece. The due diligence is monitoring the plan and updating the plan. So whatever, air quotes, the plan is, that's the piece that at the board level you need to ensure is in place. So think about if you're talking about your security journey, there's usually a few key components to it. So there's a documentation portion of your security journey. So if you're thinking strategically, what do we have documented? And is it sufficient? Once your documentation is placed, then there's the people, the training part. Do we have something deployed for security awareness, at least annually? Do the users go through some general training about recognizing phishing emails, general training about how do they alert IT or IT security that they think something's suspicious, whether it's flagging an email as spam or flagging phone calls that they're getting, pretending they're IT people to try to get them to a website to log into something. That's a training piece, and that can go with tabletops, tabletop exercises, security training, like I said. And after that, you want to sort of test your systems, and now you're getting a little bit more about the hardware piece. So penetration testing, really see if the structure, the infrastructure you put in place meets, is fit for purpose. Does it meet the requirements? And the only real way to do that is to actually physically test it. And once you get through those three main things, most companies are showing both of those, right? You're showing good due diligence and good due care. If you wanted to take it a step further than that, then you can start doing some of your red teaming and purple teaming to try to really test your personnel to see if they can do it as simulated as it can be in a real world event without it actually being a real world event. So strategically, it's those first three parts. Do I have my documentation in place? Am I regularly training my personnel and maintaining that documentation? And have I tested my system to be sure that it's actually going to work the way we think it's all been designed to work?
You also mentioned the whole question of business continuity planning. What is the difference between the incident response and the business continuity plan? Are they one and the same? Do they fit together so that we can have a kind of understanding of exactly what we're looking at?
Yeah, there's three plans. There's the incident response plan, the business continuity plan, and the disaster recovery plan. The way I think about, and they're different, but the three of them together create kind of a holistic response, big picture risk management response plan. That's probably the right way to think of that. Those three plans should be part of your risk management overall strategy. So the disaster recovery one is usually for physical disasters of some kind. I'm up here in the northern United States, so massive snowstorms, and your whole workforce can't get to work for 3 days. What do you do about that? Continuity is more supply chain issues, first in, first out. How do you ensure you have workstations for everybody, that the systems are always up and running like they should be? What is your downtime? Continuity is sort of ongoing business operations. And one of the things that can impact both a disaster recovery plan and a business continuity plan is a cybersecurity event. So your incident response plan is a little bit more specialized in responding to the specifics of a cybersecurity event. And how do we quickly, how do we quickly tell the right leadership, whether it's legal, who's responsible for getting outside counsel involved, who's responsible for getting cyber insurance involved, who's responsible for engaging, if you have a retainer, your cybersecurity retainer, like who's responsible for doing all those things? How does the work flow through the system? Like, what does IT do? What does IT security do? How do they interact with each other? Specific to the cybersecurity incident. And so while it's separate from, a continuity plan might say for cyber breaches, follow the incident response plan to ensure good business continuity. And the disaster recovery plan might say something similar. So they're sort of they're referring to each other, but the three are different enough in purpose that you should have all three, and they should be part of your total risk strategy.
Okay, thank you. I noticed you mentioned the NIST framework in terms of incident response. Are there any other frameworks that we should consider, or you would advise to be considered?
There are others. I mean, there's lots of different ways that you can try, and like ISO's good, NIST is good. They're very similar. Let's put it that way. If you think like the MITRE ATT&CK framework that helps you understand some of the threat actor behaviors, lots of think tank organizations have put together a lot of good information. The problem can be is you can get lost in the weeds, right? You can get too many decisions in the boardroom and not enough has come, into practice. So there could be information overload. I just personally happen to be a fan of NIST. I like ISO just fine also, but it's because they're similar enough, they will all work. So if you, let's say you have a particular requirement because you want to be ISO 27001, then I would recommend sort of stick with the ISO methodologies, right? If you don't and you like NIST just fine, then you'll stick with the NIST methodologies. If there's a different one that you like, like I said, there are a few. Just pick one, because especially if you're in the beginning part of your journey, the last thing you want is to confuse yourself and then take no action. So it's better to have a plan. Again, back to that board strategy, have a plan, pick a framework, and kind of run with it for a little while. If you decide later that it's not quite fit for purpose, you can evolve your plan forward in the future. But I wouldn't honestly be too terribly worried about the particular plan you're working on, as long as it's a good framework.
Okay, one final question. You mentioned having an incident response. You mentioned having an incident response partner. What are some of the key things we should be looking at when we're choosing an incident response partner?
Yeah, so can they work with your existing technology, or are they going to require deployment of a new technology? It's my recommendation you find someone who can work with your existing technology. It's a much faster response to be able to take over the evidence. Like I said before, you're collecting the evidence oftentimes already exists in some place. So being sure that whoever you pick is aware and knowledgeable. Maybe you're an IT environment, maybe you're an OT environment. If you're like heavily into manufacturing and you have a provider who has zero experience in operational technology, they're probably not the right fit for you. So they really need to be skilled and knowledgeable about your setup. Then making sure that they have good credentials. So credentials doesn't necessarily mean you know what you're doing, but if it gets to the point where courts of law are involved and disclosures to insurance and things like that, proving that you have hired a skilled professional can be important. So can they work on the stuff that you have? Are they skilled and qualified, documentably skilled and qualified in doing the job? And then it's like, what is the response time? How good customer service do they have? Do they answer your questions right away? Even if there's not a breach, are they reachable? A lot of the customer service stuff. I mean, we're all businesses too. And business relationships is important. So if you're finding it's a struggle to even get a hold of your security provider when it's not an emergency, it's maybe a bad sign that they shouldn't be your provider in an emergency.
Okay, I got you. Thanks very much.
Yep.
We're basically out of time as we prepare to move into the next session. And you mentioned the whole question of digital forensics and the incident response must work together. So in the next session, we're going to discuss a little bit more about the whole question of the forensics. But Jason, I really want to take the time to thank you for sharing your information. Very informative session. On behalf of CREST Global and the attendees, we really want to thank you for taking the time to share your vast knowledge with us. And I'm sure there are many more questions that will be coming, and Edward will be willing to pass those questions on and engage you in answering some of those questions that will come from the attendees. So again, thank you very much. And for the attendees, we are preparing to move to our next session on forensics. So we'll see you at that next session in a couple of minutes. And Jason, thank you so much again for sharing your knowledge with us.
Yeah, you're welcome. I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.